So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of New England. It's so great to look out and to recognize so many familiar faces, but also some new faces, people that I don't recognize as well. My name is James Herbert. I'm the president of the university, and I welcome you all on this beautiful evening overlooking the Saco River here in Maine for what I hope is going to be a very interesting event. So I have been concerned for some time, and I'm sure many of you have as well, about the breakdown of true discourse, of civil dialogue in our society. Increasingly, I think we live in these bubbles where we're surrounded by people who think like us, who talk like us, and we are fed through algorithms on social media the same information from people that think just like we do. And that we've seen this polarization. It's fed not only by social media, but by the 24-hour cable news cycle. And what ends up happening is we're surrounded more and more by people who just think like us, and we don't realize that there's other people who think differently about things. And the art of dialogue and discourse has largely broken down in our society. And I think this has major consequences, because if you think about it, it's through discourse that it's really the only way we have, other than violence, to change someone's mind. So not only does it keep us honest ourselves in terms of informing us, but it also is the way we use to persuade other people short of violence. And so I think it's a bad sign in our society that this art of interaction has broken down, and it's something that we need to address. So all universities, including the University of New England, have lectures. And we have many good lectures here. We have the Bush Lecture, the Merrill Lecture. Our Center for Global Humanities once a month has just phenomenal lectures. And I think we do a very good job of presenting speakers from across various spectra. However, with the traditional lecture format, it provides only limited time for the kind of interaction that I'm talking about, right? So there's a question-answer session after the lecture typically, but it doesn't really provide the sort of interaction that one would hope to have. So we conceived of this idea of having a forum where we have at least two people talking about a particular issue, a timely, important, controversial type of issue, and having a real dialogue about it. And to do that in a civil, constructive way. So if tonight these guys start throwing things at each other and calling each other names and stuff, then we will not have succeeded. What we would like to have is a robust and spirited conversation. So we don't have to be overly polite, but at the same time, civil and constructive and productive. That's the idea. And so we're hoping that in some small way, this contributes to the restoration of a true sense of interaction, not only within the academy, but more broadly. And it's really important, I firmly believe, that the academy, meaning the university, colleges, are really the ultimate marketplace of ideas. This should be a place where we get into it, we get our hands dirty, and we grapple with tough ideas. And I think that's a very important role that we have to play. And what I'm hoping tonight is that this will be an example of how we can do that. So, having said all of that, this will just be the beginning of this inaugural event, the President's Forum, and I welcome ideas from all of you about future events that we might hold, these kinds of panel discussions or interactions of some kind. So if you have ideas, if you have topics, please let me know. You can email me, and I would be delighted to hear from you. So tonight we're going to be talking about Jordan Peterson. And who is Jordan Peterson? I'm curious, show of hands, how many people have heard of Jordan Peterson before? Oh, wow, okay, so most of the room. Well, those of you who haven't, if you know a teenager, just ask them, and they'll tell you who he is. Because young people these days, most of them know who Jordan Peterson is. He's a Canadian psychologist, and he's become very famous very quickly. If you look on the New York Times bestseller list and in other lists of books, he's now at #1 with his new book that just came out in January, in fact. I first learned of him kind of not the way most people did. I'm a big fan of podcasts, and there's a particular podcast, Sam Harris has a podcast that I really enjoy, and I heard this conversation with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And I have to tell you that I could not make head nor tails of what he was talking about. I thought it sounded sort of confused and strange, and neither could Sam Harris, the guy that was hosting the podcast, couldn't make much sense of it either. And so he actually did something that was unprecedented. He invited him back a second time to try to make sense of what he was talking about. And that was a little bit clearer then, but I was a little intrigued at least, so I started looking into him. How he became really famous is that he pushed back on a law, a proposed law in Canada that was part of an expansion of the Canadian Human Rights Act. This is known as C-16. And basically what this law did in an effort to extend greater rights to transsexual individuals is that, at least in his reading of it, is it mandated the use of whatever pronouns the individual requested. So if I requested to be called she, then you have to call me she. If I requested an unconventional pronoun like sie, they, zor, then you would have to call me that. And it wasn't just a request, but it was mandated by law under penalty of even being thrown in jail to have to use these pronouns. So what he said was, no, I'm not going to do that. I refuse to do that. Throw me in jail, if you will. And that he made some videos on YouTube that he posted about that, and that sort of catapulted him to fame. And he became a critic of what he perceives as the excesses of politically correct behavior, particularly within the academy, but in society as a whole. So he sort of used that as a spearhead, started making more of these videos, and he's now on his YouTube channel. His videos have been viewed more than 35 million times. And he has a huge follower on social media. A lot of people follow him. And as I said, he's become this sort of social critic mixed up with his various ideas about religion and mythology and other kinds of things. So he's an interesting guy. He's become very polarizing. People either loathe him or they seem to love him, one or the other. And so it'll be interesting to see how our panelists deal with that. So the way that this particular topic came about is actually kind of interesting. I was sitting in my office doing my work, and this guy over here sent me an email with an essay he wrote about Jordan Peterson. He said, I thought you might find this interesting, because he and I share ideas sometimes. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And then I was having a dialogue with this gentleman over here as well on email, and he sent me an essay he wrote about Jordan Peterson. And they didn't know that they had each written essays about Jordan Peterson, and within 48 hours, I got these two essays, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. So, and I had already been interested in this whole phenomenon about this guy coming to fame so quickly. And so I asked if they would be willing to have a panel discussion, but knowing that they both those of you that know them, both gentlemen have, shall we say, rather strong personalities. And so I thought, we need someone who is like the epitome of reasonableness, a strong person who can, like, navigate between these two gentlemen. And so this is who I thought of. And so Alex Campbell. So let me tell you a little bit about who they are, and I'm very, very grateful that they're here tonight. Anouar Majid, and this is Anouar over here, is Vice President of Global Affairs and UNI's founding director of the Center for Global Humanities and the Tangier Forum in Morocco. He was the founding chair of the Department of English. He conceived and established UNI's campus in Tangier, Morocco. He also continues to manage the operations of that campus even today. He's published widely on relations between Islam and the West. His books include Islam and America, Building a Future Without Prejudice, We Are All Moors, Ending Centuries of Crusades Against Muslims and Other Minorities, A Call for Heresy, Why Dissent is Vital to Islam and America, Freedom and Orthodoxy, Islam and Difference in the Post-Andalusian Age, Unveiling Traditions, Post-Colonial Islam in a Polycentric World, and also a very interesting novel called See Yusuf. Majid's work has been widely featured in many national and international print and broadcast media, and he's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Tingus, a Moroccan-American magazine of ideas and culture, where he also edits the online version, tinusmagazine.com. David Livingstone Smith, right behind me, is an internationally renowned philosopher with a particular expertise in the philosophy of psychology. His research interests include self-deception, dehumanization, human nature, ideology, race, and moral psychology. He's the recipient of the prestigious Anisfeld Wolf Book Award for his nonfiction book in 2012, Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. He's published a number of books on psychoanalysis, as well as others on human motivation, particularly what we might call the darker side of human behavior, including Why We Lie, The Evolutionary Roots of Deception and the Unconscious Mind, and The Most Dangerous Animal, Human Nature and the Origins of War. Smith speaks widely in both academic and non-academic settings, and his work has been featured extensively in national and international media. He's currently professor of philosophy here at UNE, where he teaches courses on the philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of race, metaphysics, and other topics. And finally, our moderator, Alex Campbell. Alex comes to UNE from England, where she completed her PhD in criminology at Cambridge. She's currently associate professor in the Department of Sociology. She's published in the areas of rape prevention and power dynamics, the medicalization of mothering, race and policing, amongst other topics. She's currently working on a book on the role of race in cyberspace. She chairs the board of the Biodiversity and Research Institute and currently teaches courses on crime, globalization and technology, race, class, and gender. She also coordinates UNE's internship programs for the sociology program. And like me, Alex, and actually I think our other two panelists as well, are originally from away, as they say up here in Maine, but they all really love living in Maine, as do I. So I would also like to welcome our guests that are watching us online. This event is being live streamed through Facebook Live as well as other channels, and so we welcome all of you. And when it comes time for audience participation and question and answers, we're going to ask our folks online to type their question in as well so we can get those out. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Alex. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks all so much for coming out. It's a great attending event. I'm just going to send it right over to David Smith, who's going to give us some opening remarks, around 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'm going to hand it over to Anouar Majid, who's also going to introduce his remarks. And we're going to open it up to some questions after we've had a little bit of a discussion on stage. So, David.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for coming. And thanks for this wonderful initiative, James. This is really great. And it's really great to have a president in the saddle who's concerned about ideas and intellectual discourse. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to read some remarks because although I have written a bit on Peterson, I've got an article coming out in the next issue of Foreign Policy magazine. It's not really my area. So if I were talking about race and racism or dehumanization or genocide, I could do it in my sleep, but I really want to get this right. So I shall try to not be tedious and read it with a modicum of dramatic flair. Years ago, when my spouse was pursuing her PhD in philosophy at Cornell University, and I was living in Maine and working at the University of New England, I would regularly hop into my car on Thursdays after the last of my 3 classes and drive for 9 or 10 hours to spend a long weekend with her in Ithaca, New York. During long stretches of the journey, I would listen to Christian preachers on the radio, not because I'm religious, but because I find their rhetorical performances fascinating. Virtuoso preachers have an uncanny knack of resonating with the most aching vulnerabilities of their audience. They speak to where it hurts, first eliciting guilt, shame, resentment, and fear in their target audience, and then offering hope of salvation and redemption. Occasionally, these performances would be punctuated by testimonials by young men tearfully describing how their lives had been transformed, offered as evidence of the truth and power of God's grace. Preachers like these have a characteristic that the sociologist Max Weber called charisma, a word which in the Christian tradition refers to gifts such as prophecy, healing, and speaking in tongues that flow from God's grace. Weber adapted it to denote, quote, a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is considered extraordinary and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers. End of quote. And this brings me to Jordan Peterson. Whether one loves the content of his message, hates it, or, as in my case, finds it mostly uninteresting, it is obvious that Peterson is abundantly endowed with charismatic authority in the eyes of his many devotees. Of course, you might disagree. So, here are some common characteristics of charismatic leaders. I leave you to judge whether and to what degree the shoe fits. Historian Lawrence Rees observes that the charismatic leader, quote, must possess a strong missionary element and is almost a quasi-religious figure, end of quote. He continues, discussing charismatic leaders in the political sphere, quote, followers of such a leader are looking for more than just lower taxes or better health care, but seek broader, almost spiritual goals of redemption and salvation. The charismatic leader cannot exist easily within normal bureaucratic structures and is driven forward by a sense of personal destiny. End of quote. The charismatic leader is usually a man, because this kind of leadership is closely associated with stereotypical masculine narratives and symbolism. But he's not merely a man. He's a heroic man, fearlessly defying cowardly conformity and unconstrained by the petty rules and conventions that hamstring small-minded others. And he boldly points out facts that they are too timid or intimidated to address. He is confident and decisive, untroubled by uncertainty or self-doubt. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt perceptively remarked, quote, extraordinary self-confidence and displays of self-confidence inspire confidence in others. Pretensions of genius waken the conviction in others that they are indeed dealing with a genius. End of quote. He may be well-read and have facts at his fingertips, but his claims are grand and sweeping, perhaps even cosmic in scope. He frames his message as an apocalyptic struggle between great forces. He asserts rather than questions, propounds rather than discusses, and contemptuously caricatures both the views that he disagrees with and the people who hold them. Self-critical reflection and genuine intellectual humility seem alien to his way of being. The charismatic leader possesses prophetic vision. He offers to rescue us, to redeem us, banish the sources of anxiety or despair, to avert impending catastrophe. His message is an urgent one, alerting us to the danger posed by a powerful or even demonic enemy. Whatever its source, the leader takes pains to let us know that the menace has been ignored, underestimated, or pandered to by the complacent or complicit members of ruling elites. The charismatic leader appears to be sincere, usually because he really is sincere. He embraces his prophetic calling and fully commits to the truth and value of his redemptive project. His power resides in large measure in the aura of authenticity that he projects. The charismatic leader performs sincerity. He is a master of stagecraft with a gut-level understanding of the power of long, dramatic silences and animated gesticulations, and an uncanny ability to find just the form of words that are most likely to inspire the listeners whom he targets. To those untouched by his gospel, he seems arrogant, grandiose, and narcissistic. But to members of the community surrounding him, the experience is something akin to being in love. And like the lover whose beloved has been disparaged, followers of charismatic leaders are prone to lash out, mock, or even threaten those who question their leader and their relationship with him. I anticipate being the target of such unpleasantries in consequence of tonight's event. Too late. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, he has an instinctive feel for the emotional pulse of his target audience, understanding them better than they understand themselves, and is able to diagnose and respond to their pains, confusions, and frustrations. Many social scientists have pointed out that such leaders often come forward during times of rapid social change, when established norms are losing their grip and traditional identities are fraying or are thrown into disarray. In every such transition, there are those who feel disenfranchised by changes, those who no longer are confident of their place, or that of others, and can no longer count on the ordinary assumptions and routines of social life to secure what seems to be the natural order. It is people like these to whom charismatic leaders often reach out. Because they create and attract followers and inspire uncritical devotion, charismatic leaders can do immense harm. For example, by inspiring acts of violence. But this is by no means necessary or even mostly the case. As is evidenced by the presumably sincere testimonials featured on religious radio shows, charismatic leaders may transform the lives of their followers in constructive ways. Still, there's something inherently injurious about charismatic authority because it undermines followers' autonomy, often in the guise of promoting it. The charismatic leader may loudly and explicitly promote the importance of truth, critical thinking, and the ethic of personal freedom, while implicitly subverting these very values through his dazzling rhetoric. He may urge his followers to take responsibility for their lives, to be reflective and self-critical, to courageously speak truth to power, and to realize their human potential, while at the same time cultivating their idealization of him, fostering their intellectual and moral subservience, and never challenging their abject failure to critically assess his pronouncements. The 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that autonomy is precious because it provides the platform upon which morality and rationality rest. You don't have to swallow the whole Kantian framework to hold that there's truth to this claim. It implies that, however well-intended, and whatever positive consequences might flow from behaving in ways that erode others' autonomy, this is a gesture of profoundest disrespect. Acting in ways that subvert autonomy and personal responsibility in the name of promoting autonomy and personal responsibility, failing to push back against rampant idealization or to encourage critical and skeptical reflection on the claims that one promotes, are common and deeply problematic aspects of charismatic communities. Bringing it home now. You don't have to be stupid, uneducated, gullible, or deplorable to fall in love with a charismatic leader. Life can be hard and is full of uncertainty, vulnerability, and disappointment. It is, as Jordan Peterson so rightly emphasizes, full of suffering, heartbreak, and tragedy. Because of this, and because of the uniquely human capacity to envisage a different world, it is part of the human condition to have a weak spot for salvation. Make no mistake, charismatic leaders are, to a large extent, fashioned from the needs and wishes of their followers. Sometimes these needs and wishes are cynically manipulated. Sometimes they're not. It's easy for we smug academics to sneer at those whom we recognize as true believers in would-be saviors. But the attraction of charisma is something to which none of us is entirely immune. And this makes it all the more important to resist, and to help others to resist, and to discriminate, to take what is good, to reject what is bad, to be critical and reflective, and then to move on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And Anouar, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for good evening. Thank you for inviting me, James, to participate in this debate. Unfortunately, I have not prepared my remarks, and if David feels this is not his kind of area of expertise, I am even remotely connected to this thing, as Ali just reminded me recently. But and everything, about 50% of what I know about psychology and evolutionary psychology is from David Smith. I read 4 of his books very avidly and very carefully. Some of them, one of them at least I reviewed while I shared with the faculty members. So about 50% of my knowledge of the field comes from David Smith's work. And the other 50%, or at least 40%, comes from the late colleague of ours, Rob Haskell, and his work on unconscious communication and so on. And I wanted, before I proceeded, to dedicate this event to Rob Haskell, who has been very instrumental in connecting me with David, and also in bringing David to UNE. So he did a very good thing for the institution. The reason why I got interested in, and I need to make another prefatory remark, and basically next weekend, this coming weekend actually, this Sunday, my family and I, we are going to New York City to attend a lecture by Jordan Peterson at the Beacon Theater. It's a tremendous accomplishment. I'm taking 2 kids, a family, we are making a pilgrimage of sorts. So we may have succumbed to that charismatic power of Jordan Peterson. And the reason I'm doing that is because I am totally fascinated by this man. And one of the few academics, in fact, the only academic that I know in my experience, who is being handled by an agency, creative artist agency out of Hollywood, and the same agency that handles George Clooney and Meryl Streep and Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, for those of you who know Real Madrid. So it's unusual in the annals of higher education to have an academic with only 2 books to be treated in this kind of fashion. So it is we're dealing here with a phenomenon that transcends the narrow academic interested and squabbles that we often find in higher education and beyond. In my essay, the essay that I shared with James and others, I call him a prophet. Behold, a prophet on the lands of Canada. And it's, when I looked at him very closely, and again, I'm playing into the theme of the charisma thing. When I read this man's life, and I saw his impact on people, young people, and people of all ages, actually, I could not come up with a term to describe him. He doesn't seem like the typical academic, someone like, let's say, Steven Pinker, or even Noam Chomsky, or someone like that, for whom I have tremendous respect. And by the way, Chomsky came to speak at the Center for Global Humanities, and in fact, came to UNE twice. So he is not that kind of person. He is not even like David Smith, who is very accomplished and speaks all over the globe, but he doesn't have, I don't know anyone, literally anyone in higher education who resembles the persona, who matches the persona of Jordan Peterson. So I struggling a little bit with the first book, Maps of Meaning, which is almost inscrutable, by the way. I have nothing much to say about the book except occasional insights into some passages here and there. And then the book's 12 Rules of Life, which is fascinating, and I read in its entirety, and in fact took extensive notes. And he has the very basic rules. One of them is to try to learn from someone who has something to say, like David. The other one is to be precise in your speech, which I'm trying to do tonight. So and what I learned, what I saw in this person is exactly what David is seeing, but from a different perspective. In other words, I see the masses resonating to this person, responding to him for a reason that I could not myself understand. That's why I was tempted to call him something else, but then I used the word prophet. Eventually, somebody else used the word Messiah. And he's some kind of a savior. Sometimes when he talks about his experiences, when he's going to Los Angeles and he finds a father and son embracing because of him, or reconnecting because of the power of his work and his books. His theories are very basic. He just gives advice that my grandmother would have given me, or your grandfather would have given you. There's nothing special about the kind of advice that he gives. But the question remains, why are people responding to him in this fashion? Why would he be the #1 on Amazon for I don't know how long, for a couple of weeks? The same thing in the UK, Australia. There's something going on that needs some kind of explanation. I personally, and some of us in this room particularly people who come from North Africa and the Middle East, we don't need any more prophets or messiahs or anything like that. We've had plenty of those, and in fact, we're moving away from them. And so that is not the point. The fact, but I have to say, I was seduced by the idea of imagining a prophet from the lands of Canada. I mean, we never had prophets from Scandinavian countries or from Nordic countries. And I said, maybe this is the time for the North to have its say, to have a place in the pantheon of prophets. So from the lands of Canada, from Edmonton, arrives this man, very interesting life, by the way. If he had, in fact, we know more about the life of Jordan Peterson than we do about the lives of the prophets. And so we know the way he grew up, the way he went to school, and the way he got interested in clinical psychology. And by the way, I am surrounded by psychologists, as you probably know. He's a clinical psychologist, and our dear president is a clinical psychologist, or a psychologist. And so David has a lot of interest in psychology. It's true. It's an interesting field. That warrants another kind of discussion. The rise of psychologists as healers, who's key caregivers to a society that's adrift. That's another interesting subject that should be part of this discussion. I don't know whether we'll even touch on that. I see you laughing. The other thing is, as I said now, David, the assumption was that I am a follower of his, or that I subscribe to some of his theories, or to some of his principles. That is a question that needs another session, but there are some things that I see that are very interesting in what he says, and there are some things, quite frankly, I have no interest in whatsoever. There are things, but what interests me, and what interests me is the response of the people. Not only of the people who are responding to him, but the response of the academics to him and the response of the media to him. They don't know what to make of him. But I want to quote one interesting review by Nathan Robinson in Current Affairs. This is a PhD candidate at Harvard, very great, one of the best reviews I've read. And I don't know whether you've read it.
Yeah, it's excellent.
It's called The Intellectual We Deserve. And then at some point in that review, it's a long review, it's a very dismissive and damning review of the intellectual powers of Jordan Peterson. But then at some point he says this: if Jordan Peterson is the most influential intellectual in the Western world has lost its damn mind. Trust me. And now I'm going to speak a little bit, I'm going to improvise a little bit. I've known this for a long time. Watching the Western world, it's not a new thing. These kinds of conditions that we are seeing here have been with us for a very long time. It led me to thinking about how foreigners interpreted America back to Europeans. We go back to the early colonial days. We even, Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, you see some of this in Alexis de Tocqueville. You see, of course, Charles Dickens. And recently I reread the D.H. Lawrence's Classics in American Studies and now literature. So what he says about the United States, it's almost quoting verbatim what we're seeing today. And there are others, there are French people who came to the United States and said the same thing. I brought some with me, but I don't want to quote too much. But the idea is they see a society that is enthralled to power and money and success, a society that is given to violence, all kinds of different violences, by the way, and a society that is, although it is democratic, that demands a tremendous amount of conformity. In fact, at the peril of being persecuted if you dare to distance yourself from it. So it is a society that needs explanation, a society that needs to be interpreted, a society that needs to be given some guidance. Now, these are the things that interest me in the persona of Jordan Peterson. The things that I disagree with him about. And I'm not going to apologize for that. So the thing is, he gives short shrift to big ideas like Marxism, for example, or postmodernism, and he reduces them very quickly. He dismisses them very quickly in passages that they come across as rather simplistic. And of course, no one has enough time to spend a lifetime trying to understand what postmodernism is, for example, or postmodernity, or what Marxism is. But if we did, if there would be follow-ups or corrections or explanations or elaborations on the kinds of themes he brings up in his work, you'd find that postmodernism, and it's been, for example, explained in a variety of different works, but this is an old trend in the humanities now that's been dying off for a while. It's a condition that's associated with the post-industrial society. Let's say, this is roughly speaking, I cannot give you all the details, but around the end of the 1950s, the United States, they shifted from an industrial society to a service economy. So where new jobs appeared, industries gradually vanished from the social scene, and new ways of being emerged. So the postmodern condition, as explained by materialist analysis, or even in the work of someone like Jean-François Lyotard that you probably know, who said in this kind of setting, especially which coincided with the decline of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the grand meanings, the grand narratives have ceased to have meaning. So then there emerged a new regime of small truths, of conjectural truths, of situational truths that are not necessarily founded in the old dogmas of ideology. And by the way, Daniel Bell also, in his book, The End of Ideology, which was published more around the same time, announced the coming of this end of these grand narratives that shaped people's lives. Religion was vanishing, big political parties didn't have any hold on the adherents, communism was in decline, even unions in other parts of the globe were in disarray, individuals were emerging into a brave new world without solid foundations, and they're trying to make sense of it the best way they can. So it is not a conspiracy against the West, and in fact, it is a reflection of what happened to Western peoples as they had to adapt to new economic and social models. It is that area of his work that I find not fully elaborated, and I wish he could go back to that if somebody is watching online or elsewhere, to do this kind of work, or do this kind of clarification. So that is the part that needs debating. But for me personally, as I said, when I watch the fascination of people with this man, the devotion that they have for him, it only explains to me, it justifies that there is something that has gone awry in the Western tradition. Whatever Western tradition is, it could be the United States and Canada, I don't know whether Mexico is part of it or not, or France and Europe, France and the UK, I don't know whether Spain is part of it or not, or Portugal. So it's a very fuzzy concept, but suffice it to say that there is something happening in these societies that explains the rise of people like Jordan Peterson. We could use other examples in the world of politics, in the world of even entertainment, and so on and so forth. To me personally, and to go back, I don't know, to go back to some of the things I've said, I'm going to use even a postmodern concept, maybe a post-structuralist concept, I don't know, maybe quoting Roland Barthes, or maybe Michel Foucault, to say that whether the persona of Jordan Peterson is completely irrelevant to the discussion. Because, as you know, what is important in this discussion is the notion of the text, or the meaning generated by the text. And so we know, as we read, as we discuss this, instead of falling into the trap of, I am liberal, you're conservative, I am pro this, you're anti that, we should try, to me, Jordan Peterson is an invitation to reflect or try to understand what is happening in these societies at this time, what is happening to people's thinking, to their belief systems, to their vision of the future. You use the word heroism, is maybe there's a lack of heroes for a lot of people. What is happening to the meaning of life? In fact, you know, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about meaning. He is less interested, even though he's less interested in biology than he is in meaning, because meaning is, at the end of the day, more interesting and more fascinating than biological structures. So it is this crisis of meaning in the United States, in Canada, in probably the UK, I'm not sure, and other parts of the globe, or other West, that have generated the persona and have given rise to Jordan Peterson, and that is something I'd like to continue to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Anouar. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anouar. David, I'm going to pick up on a few points that you've made in a moment, Anouar, but you talked a lot about the charismatic leader, David, and I want to kind of push you a little bit, or to think about the kinds of audience that Jordan Peterson is appealing to, because my sense is it is not appealing to everyone, right? So if you asked perhaps young women who listen to that message, it might not be quite as appealing as to some kind of disaffected millennial man who might kind of find his analogies to lobsters and so forth and standing up straight and being dominant. That might be a more appealing message to a particular type of person. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, that is standard, a standard feature of charisma. Charismatic leaders, and this is something Rees talks about, will entrance some and leave others cold. That can be for a variety of factors. I think the factor that you're pointing out, which is pretty important, is a demographic one. And it's quite clear and quite uncontroversial that the main consumers of Peterson's message are young men, and that Peterson makes a pitch about how can I put it? The restoration of traditional masculine roles, which he associates with order. In fact, he associates masculinity with order and femininity with chaos. And he makes statements, I mean, in the book, such as women want men who outclass them. So there's a certain appeal, I think, to young men who feel that they are, qua men, adrift and not party to the sort of respect and self-respect that they think is owed to them. Yeah.
And I think he also talks a lot about there being some kind of undercurrent violence between male interactions and how. Yeah, I mean, I find I often I've listened to a lot of his videos, and there is seems to me a real preoccupation with this kind of macho imagery of violence and the hero and the warrior and stuff like that, which to me as a Jewish guy just leaves me cold. I have to be straightforward with you. Yeah, so that's part of that masculinity package. And I'm curious, Anouar, if you have a sense of who that audience is. You talk about him as though he were, fairly. Many people would find him charismatic, like a prophet. But again, I'm curious about whether you think about the diversity of audience and the interpretations people make of Peterson's work. There's in that same article that you cited in Current Affairs, the author talks about there being many Petersons. Pick your Peterson, because depending on the audience, depending on his subject, you can get a lot of different meaning from what he's saying. I'm curious about that demographic issue for you. Is that something you consider?
Yes, I'm not a sociologist though, So I do pay attention, but I don't pay a lot of attention to who is paying attention to him. It may be, that's because he is not something that I'm studying seriously. I'm interested in him as a phenomenon. I mean, I don't know the statistics. I don't know if there have been any studies, any analytical study to show exactly what kind of demographic, age group, and so on that have been studying him. I don't know. I mean, recently I had a conversation with, I don't even know what troll is, by the way. I just recently I've been asking what a troll is.
You'll find out real soon.
And James kindly explained it to me, and he said they are real. But I don't know what they are really, except that there's a publication in Morocco, and it's very popular. It's called Hespres. It's a news site that's it's viewed across the Arab world. It's one of the top publications, and there are usually hundreds of comments following each and every article, and they're usually more or less the same. They're very polemical and very feisty, and they're either critical or angry or something. So one day, some official in the government explained to me that a lot of 80-90% of these people who are commenting are between the ages of 16 and 19, and who live in certain rural areas, because the government is keeping track of who is commenting on that site. So I'm assuming that the NSA or some organization in the United States is keeping track of who's commenting on this website and who are these people. So I don't know. I mean, I'm just using the example of Morocco. I don't know whether they would apply here or not, but I have no idea. Some people say it's males, it's mostly males who watch him, but I don't know what kind of age. When people realized I was going to go to his lecture in New York City at the Beacon Theater, I got some messages from people who are going as well, and they seem to be middle-aged and with families and stuff like that. I have no idea. I cannot be very precise with you about who is watching and his videos.
I think, on an interview, I think he said himself that around 80% of his YouTube followers, for example, are males. I'm not sure he went into the age of that. But I'm curious, thinking about, you're curious about the kind of meaning that he has for people. I do think that kind of demographic is potentially very important in kind of giving us insight into the kinds of people that feel potentially bereft or potentially without meaning. Is it, I think in his book, his 12 rules, I don't know if you have, of course, I read your review. He seems to be speaking to a particular type of person. And I wonder if that same message, and this actually comes from, it's based on a question that came from Dr. Julie Peterson. She has a class in Women and Gender Studies, and they got together before the spring break and generated some questions. And one of the students' questions was whether those rules that he wrote would apply to everybody in an equal way. So, for example, do they apply to women as they do to men? Do they apply to black people, minorities, as they do to white people? Do they apply to trans people as they do to straight people? And so I was curious on both your takes on that. I know that you've been talking about something else, David, but
I think he would say yes. I mean, I'm pretty much skeptical of the whole rule business. So I can't say they would or would not apply, because I'd be more inclined to interrogate the rules themselves. But yeah, I would guess that he would say, yeah, these are universally applicable rules for living a good, successful, and fulfilling life.
I don't know what to add to this, but I think, again, I don't have the statistics, I don't have the analytics, but what's amazing to me, and it really needs explanation, I mean, you're probably better qualified to do this, we need someone, if he's number one on Amazon for like, I don't know how long, and in the UK, and in Australia, but who is buying his books? And why is everybody want to invite him to everything? And why is being handled by this incredible agency that only handles people like George Clooney? So it must be something bigger than what people think. On what people think, I don't know exactly what it is. How big, I don't know exactly how much.
Yeah, can I just respond? I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's, again, a commonplace, as I tried to allude to, that charismatic leaders are constructed by their followers to a very great extent. Followers have something to work with, but then there's this, well, if you put it unkindly, folie à deux, you put it kindly, a community that develops out of both, from materials from both vectors. And I think you're quite right. There has been this profoundly anti-intellectual current in American thought, which has, and in British thought, by the way, which this is perhaps one manifestation of, in that what's been left there's a gap left behind, but I think this has been augmented recently, and I really think it's been augmented by the failure of the academy. I think that academics, and the reason for that is very complex, but one piece of it is the aloofness of academics, particularly in the humanities, from things that matter to people, right? What I call our smugness. Another is the emergence of the corporate university, where disciplines devoted to these topics are under-resourced, and the STEM disciplines, which pull in money, are highly resourced. And part of the function of that is that of both these factors is that the humanities, devoted to these sorts of big ideas and uniquely positioned to critique them, have lost cultural cachet. They've lost what cultural credibility they've had and are just hanging on now. And so what's happened, I think, in the realm of the internet is that vacuum is being filled by sort of a shadow academy of, people listen to Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or numerous others. They'll listen for hours to conversations about ideas, things that they cannot get from institutions like our own.
So, David, can I ask you then, do you think this is something to, not just about the academy, but about the failure of the left, to really give people and provide people with some meaning? So, I think that, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about political correctness, this idea of political correctness gone mad. He doesn't think that white privilege is a real phenomenon. He doesn't really have much time for safe spaces and this idea of kind of snowflakes. And I'm curious whether you think that when he says things like that he finds that an audience, a large audience, finds it quite satisfying that he will kind of go and say those things which are kind of slightly outrageous, but which kind of because they have kind of a bereft of meaning in some other areas, at least in terms of the political alternative, a left political alternative.
Yeah. So I mean, when people talk about meaning, I never know what they mean. So really, I just don't know what they mean. I don't get it. So I'll leave that bit of vocabulary out. Yeah, well, there's a lot of silliness that goes on the left, and a lot of people that don't take their moral and political mission sufficiently seriously. And there's a kind of peculiar sort of an autoimmune disease, the left attacking its own. And there's this very peculiar phenomenon of the proliferation of what have become slurs to characterize the left. So a lot of folks, and you'll find if you go through Peterson's Twitter feed and things like this, you'll find slurs being thrown around as honest characterizations of people. Terms like political correctness, which I think is a slur, and it fails to take seriously a whole range of attitudes and commitments, some of them silly, and some of them profoundly morally serious. Or terms like social justice warrior, which I think is a despicable term to characterize people. And I think that perhaps there's a kind of enthusiasm about taking down a peg or two those on the left who are seen as elitists ensconced in their trivial research in and safe, what are believed to be safe university jobs. There's whole mythology about how luxurious academic work is, right? And folks want to take that down. And I think I can understand something of the motive for that.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one final question before we turn it over to the audience. But I have a question for you, Anouar. So, you seemed quite impressed by his writing and that he's, very learned and very, well, not particularly learned, but there's something about his writing that's very compelling, right? And, one of his tactics, and you talk about postmodernism, and you talk about how he caricatures postmodernism and Marxism, in fact, the whole discipline of sociology, and I'm a sociologist. And I'm curious whether you think that it's almost intentional. Could it be that it's a strategy, a rhetorical strategy to basically kind of create a straw man of disciplines that would be the disciplines that would legitimately would critique him legitimately on kind of academic grounds, and that he foresees that, and instead of kind of dealing with it in an honest way and kind of, dealing with ideas around structure and agency, he instead demonizes these entire disciplines, says we should defund women and gender studies departments as an example in postmodernists. But that he's not necessarily being serious, but he's using it as a tactic, right, to kind of almost discredit his opposition, if you want.
Yeah, and this is, I'm going to follow up on what David said, and to really, what it is people are looking for extra academic spaces to hold up, to carry on these conversations. And absolutely, the academy has failed society as a whole in terms of being the pioneer and the forum in which such conversations could take place, whether you're critical of something or for something. And this is why we commend the initiative that James has done, because it's opening up these spaces where these kinds of conversations could happen, and in fact, to rescue the academy and to bring back the conversations into the academy and not let them happen in this no man's land. And I see, for me personally, I wish I had been part of a conversation. I mean, for me, the big debate of my academic career was something like Edward Said arguing with the historian Bernard Lewis. So those are big debates. And in these two cases, Bernard Lewis mastered about 7 languages. Edward Said knew a variety of languages. They roamed broadly over cultures and centuries and civilizations. Now we are looking at something else. We are looking at grievances. We are looking at people expressing grievances in a pseudo-intellectual fashion. And they're trying, but they're resonating. That's the key. They're resonating with people. People are buying that stuff. People they have a tremendous need to hear something that is not being heard in other circles, including the media, by the way, and which is why we have all this political drama happening in the United States right now. I think conversations in academia have not been capacious enough to include all points of views, all positions, and without people resorting to emotional threats. Very often you find these days, which is why one of the principles of Jordan Peterson's is to be precise in your speech, and I'm trying to be, is people usually respond to things. I'm upset. This upsets me. I am horrified. I am angry about what's being said, instead of responding intellectually to things. And even if the thing is frightening, if you look at how people in the United States respond to tragedy, for example, to minor ones, to little crises, in fact, of the quotidien, of the daily life, as opposed to what the Syrians respond to their catastrophes, or to the Afghans respond to their. That's a huge, vast difference. And yet, and this is something that's personal to me, people in higher education, in academia, would stand up and pontificate and begin to speak knowledgeably about the rest of the world as if they shared the same emotions, the same traumas, and the same dramas. No, we are talking about a very specific cultural setting, a very specific social and cultural setting in which has enabled such people to emerge. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and a number of others in settings that are not purely, well, he's an academic, but as I said, in alternative intellectual settings to make sense or to speak to people who have been abandoned en masse.
Thank you, Anouar. And I'd love to open it up to the audience for questions. If you can just put your hand up, and there's somebody going to be running around with a microphone so you can be heard on tape.
Firstly, thank you so much. Well, what an interesting discussion to have. My question is, I want to know if you can speak to the specificity of language that he uses, and whether or not you believe he's actually being specific, or if that, when he isn't specific, if that distracts from his message.
That's really hard, and I'm really uncomfortable talking about things that I have to take a guess at. So let me just put it this way. It seems to me that Peterson's rhetoric alternates between the quite precise and the incredibly fuzzy. But it moves so quickly that it's very hard for me to track. And he alludes to so many things that I don't know enough about to assess, that I feel like someone running behind a bus trying to catch it, right?
I'm not part of the panel, but just to say that I think that a lot of it's quite difficult because some of it's self-help, so kind of very specific advice. It seems like, of course, like very obvious stuff, and I think that it makes it sound very kind of clever and intelligent the way he kind of talks about it. And I think from there, he kind of moves on to these large generalities around whole departments and ways of thinking that become very confusing, right? There's probably all of you have seen, if you know much about him, the very famous Channel 4 Kathy Newman interview where she really tried to pin him down, and it was actually quite tricky because she would say, so you're saying this, and he would say, no, I'm not saying that. And just when you think you kind of knew what he was saying, she would say it again, like, so you're saying this, and he would say, oh, no, I'm not saying that. And so it's almost as though the vagaries, for me at least, I probably shouldn't be personal opinion, but the vagaries of what he says actually make it very difficult for me to kind of work out what exactly he's saying. I'd hate to like debate him, bring a one-on-one, because I was saying, you're saying that, and he would say, no, I'm not saying that. You know, there's like, so the big undercurrent of when you look at the comments on some of his YouTube videos, for example, so I spent my whole week looking at the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson. And what's interesting is that a lot of things he says, for example, around gender essentialism, there's an awful lot of space to interpret it in some pretty significant ways. So, for example, this idea of kind of violence against women, you know, and if you'd asked him about violence against women, I'm 100% certain he would say, absolutely, I'm not endorsing violence against women. What are you talking about? Until you look at the comments of some of his supporters, and they say things like, yeah, you know, women should be hit, you know, like a lady shouldn't be hit, no, but you know, but another kind of woman should be hit. And I think those kinds of comments should give us some insight into the kinds of meaning that people take from what he's saying. So I'm not sure if it's getting to your question, but it kind of, I think it touches on that very specific, here's some advice, here are some large ideas that I'm sharing that could be interpreted in very many ways.
Also, if I may say so, he is a tremendously unconventional thinker. I'm going to tell you why. He's only published 2 books. He's a full professor, I think. He's a full professor at the University of Toronto, and he taught at Harvard before. The first book, Maps of Meaning, I've never seen a book like it. It talks about, he mixes, you know, religion, Jungian, what would you call it, psychology, archetypes, personal anecdotes. It's a very interesting publication for someone who's seeking to make a place in higher education, academia. So that tells me he's a bit of a risk taker. To write a book like that, that's so unconventional, and to spend years doing it, and to come up with that kind of product, It's a very interesting, and then to follow it up with this self-help, which a book that seems to be like a self-help book, designed, I mean, by the way, I should say, this is enormously long. I mean, the book should have been the size of a manifesto, this 12 Rules of Life. I mean, it should be cut by at least 150 pages. It's way, way too long, and I wish his editors had told him that, but it's a different perspective.
Thanks,
So.
Anouar. Do you have another handout at the back there? Thank you.
Here we go, Jean Hay.
Anouar, you keep asking why does he have this great agent? The answer is because he taps into one of the most challenging questions of our time. Are we becoming too PC and too careful for our own good and too into identity politics? Or is all the history of oppression, racism, and discrimination catching up with us, and all of that's appropriate? This was supposed to be a debate about Jordan Peterson. I have no idea what you guys disagree about. So to bring it way down, the reason so many people watch him is because he's willing to say, I'm not going to use the language you want to use. I'm not going to use the pronouns you want to use. You consider yourself a social justice warrior. I don't take you that seriously. And a lot of people, as Alex said, oh, yes, finally, that's what we want to hear. So I'd like to hear your guys' opinions about that. Have we become too PC, too careful, too focused in on names and language and identity politics at the expense of what's really important and free speech? Thank you.
What do you mean by PC?
And I don't like the term either, but to use it in the culture of that the things that we call each other issues and such matters more than having genuine debates about it.
Well, I think that actually the election of Donald Trump is important in this respect. A lot of people, you can change ways of talking without changing the sentiments underlying them. And I think a lot of what's happened in this country is that certain ways of speaking have become socially unacceptable. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a very good thing. But the sentiments underlying them have not really changed. And so people feel that they're being compelled to behave inauthentically. And once in a while, someone comes along who gives them permission, either by injunction or example or both, to behave authentically in ways that can be quite repulsive and destructive. So there are widespread and very peculiar beliefs, say, that the United States is a post-racial society, and that people who complain about the prevalence of racism are talking, if you'll pardon my French, bullshit, and that if anything, white people are the main recipients of racism, not black people. I just came back from Alabama. That is not the case, right? So there's a kind of desire, I guess, an understandable desire, to be honest about socially impermissible ways of talking. And I think this is what gets packaged in those caricatures and slurs about social justice warriors and snowflakes and political correctness.
Well, I mean, let's use some of the tools of postmodern analysis or post-structural analysis to look at the two terms, political correctness. I mean, it reminds me of a conversation when a human rights activist went to Morocco interviewing an Islamist, a very famous Islamist, about the lack of human rights in a particular kind of Islamic ideology, and that the sheikh, or that guru, if you will, welcomed him and was very kind, and he asked him, he told him, before we have this conversation, let's you and I agree what constitutes the human. So, in effect, what is being politically correct? And that is a question that needs another it needs to be teased out and be deconstructed, if you will, to know exactly what we're talking. Are we talking about we're essentializing a variety of groups of people, a variety of experiences? Are we saying that these people are defined by those attributes that they are referring, that they claim that they have? Or are we going to go back to the old progressive movements, and I started out as a socialist and a Marxist, where you see everybody the same, we're all struggling for the same purpose, to topple or to change or to bring down capitalism, for example. And by the way, this is the big elephant in the room. All this conversation is happening while the ruling classes, if you want to call them the capitalist classes, are doing their job, and they're completely unaffected by this drama unfolding in the midst of their society. So the tremendous crisis happening in society. Some of this could be explained economically. Some of it could be explained historically. Some of them are specific to American culture. The question of race, for example, is not exactly the same in other parts of the globe, and so on and so forth. I am personally skeptical of the notion of political correctness and all forms of essentialisms. I once said, to the chagrin of my colleagues and probably to the consternation of people like David, there is no such thing as biology. And so when people begin to refer to me as something as a biological creature, let's say, for example, I'm a man. All men are the same. Well, I beg to differ. What kind of man are you talking about? Are you talking about me? Are you talking about David Smith? I mean, there's the biological infrastructure. Even biology can be complicated, by the way, as we know. And so there are the cultural and social experiences that define a person: language, history, memory, and so on and so forth. So the way a man acts in Morocco is not the way the same man acts or another man acts in Alabama and in Mexico City. So these categorizations, even when we get into the realm of gender, even when you say men versus women, I personally don't buy that dichotomy. And the same applies for a lot of other things, because I think that experiences, the way I understand myself, is defined by a series of cultural experiences. An African American man, for example, is defined by a series of experiences that are not exactly the same as one might find among a white person in Farmington, Maine, and so on and so forth. And to speak anecdotally, from my own personal experience, and I said this before in some meetings with my colleagues, the 30-some years I've been in the United States, I gotta tell you something. I never met a racist. I never met one. The racist is always somebody else. I don't know who it is. I never met one, and yet everybody agrees that we live in a racist society. I don't know where they are. I don't know. I've never met one. I never had somebody confess to me that I am a racist, and so on and so forth. But by contrast, I've had people of different races, so to speak to me in a way that they probably would not have spoken to another member of another race. So it's a very interesting situation. What I'm saying here is this: when we say something like political correctness, or we try to divide society along easily identifiable lines, I would argue that these lines are fuzzier than people think. They're more complex, and identity is way more complex than we are led to believe in this PC, in the lexicon of PC politics.
Okay, there's a question, there's a questioner over here. So did you have your hand up? Yeah. And I would just say, as the microphone goes to her, Jordan Peterson would not be a fan of yours because he likes to talk in essentialist notions about gender, and you'd be too postmodern for him, I think.
Thank you. Thank you all for the goodwill and the commitment to dialogue and robust discussion that you're initiating. If I may be so bold, my experience in the audience is that the question you ask about why Peterson is successful is being answered here in that Peterson's success, as our earlier questioner pointed out, is in his ability to speak to those questions of deep personal significance that are maybe more guttural or more emotional. And here we are in a room and we have people across all generations, young people in school and older people with gray hair and people like me who are parents, who are here compelled by this topic because we want to have an authentic conversation about what we really care about and what we really believe, which may or may not be supported by an analysis via any particular academic lens that you're familiar with. So what I would really be interested in hearing is if you might engage the audience in how many people in this room have felt positively affected by Jordan Peterson's work. How many people are outraged by it? And where are we as a group? And perhaps the group would like to ask you some questions, or maybe you have questions of the group, and I would be enlivened by that.
Why don't you ask the question first?
Well, how many people in this, thank you, bold move. I would love to see a show of hands for how many people are here because they are enthusiastically affected by Jordan Peterson's work. Wow, that's fascinating. So people who are supporters of Jordan Peterson are in the minority in this room. And may I assume, are the rest of you here because you are in the opposite camp? Are you polarized against his message? Can you show your hands if that's where you align? Oh no, okay, so some people are polarized. Now, are the majority of you unsure, or do you see a positive and negative? Are you in the middle? You're nodding your heads. You're in the middle. You're not sure how you feel. Okay, wonderful. And so what I would love to hear is what would you like most out of this conversation? What would enliven you most to hear from them about helping you navigate that middle terrain?
Thanks so much. And let's open it up to some, absolutely taking your, in the spirit of which you've just gave, let's open some more questions. Ali.
Well, I thank you very much. I have a confession. I don't know anything about this gentleman, and I'm ignorant about him. And what I could tell you that I'm gonna definitely take note and read and look at, apparently I'm behind, or maybe not. What I gathered from both David and Anouar, two ways of making sense of his ideas. The first one is through the charismatic analysis of the message and the messenger, and how charisma can give us a tool to understand the popularity of this gentleman. Which is, I think, most social science will agree with David in that sense, because Max Weber, the German eminent sociologist and historian, tried to give us an explanation for not Peterson's work, but also many other cases. Because I think the trouble here is not to look at this case in isolation. I will claim that Oprah Winfrey, I claim that Rush Limbaugh, there are many, many prophets and prophetesses in the society around us with huge following. Anouar seems to suggest for us not to focus on just on the charisma. He regards him as a prophet, which is maybe an agreement in a way with what David is saying. But at the same time, he's saying that look at the condition, look at the situation that we are in. I always ask my students, and I'll come to my question at the end, bear with me, to ask two questions. The two questions I ask my students, so it will not become open-ended, is to ask who this scholar or author or philosopher writing for, who is this author is writing against, and what's the historical context around us that allows us to locate a philosopher, a scholar like Peterson or so. Otherwise, it becomes open-ended. I like this guy, I hate this guy, I so and so, and I have no tolerance for that. Because knowledge and charisma, unless situated in historical context, it becomes open-ended debate. So I think if that's really the case, I would like both of you, or one of you, to share with us your insights, not only about Peterson, but the conditions around that allowed a charismatic, articulate person like Peterson to become such a phenomenon. Second, is also to think of the last election, our 2016 election, and see if there is any resemblance or a discrepancy between the phenomenon that we are talking about or not. And finally, imagine that Peterson appeared and talked in the age of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Whether his charisma and his ideas would become as widespread and popular. Thank you.
That was kind of a complicated question. I can't remember the beginning once you got to the end. I think we have, to a great extent, done that, at least what you were first talking about, that we've tried to say something about who it is that is particularly receptive to this message, and it's kind of dribbled out more in the Q&A, and why that might be. So there's been a little bit of historical and cultural situating. I mean, with regard to with respect to the civil rights question, that's going to depend on which side he's on. I'm not sure, right? You would need to elaborate the thought experiment a little bit more carefully in order for me to give a speculative response. But I'm kind of, in light of what the previous questioner said, I'm kind of reluctant to speculate about these things, because if we want to understand what it is that, more specifically, that people feel that Peterson is giving them, I think we have to ask people who believe they're getting something from Peterson. I've never actually had a conversation. I've been mocked and slandered by Peterson supporters, but I've never actually had a conversation in which someone has explained to me what this very special thing is that he gives them.
And so we've had time for one more question, and perhaps we can actually speak to somebody who has something very positive to say about Peterson. Yes, a question there.
As a Jordan Peterson fan, I think what exactly just took course now kind of gives the power of what he offers. He offers 12 rules of life that are very direct and simple, and I came here to listen to a debate which is supposed to be one side for, one side against, and a moderator, and I didn't get one for or against, and the person that was against admittedly didn't even read his material. So the lack of integrity in academia, which is what he talks about, is kind of on display here, because the person for him that calls him a prophet doesn't want to actually defend his simple rules of life, and the person that's arguing against him admittedly didn't even read his material. So do you think that lack or his directness is what captivates an audience?
I think you raised. I'm the moderator. So, and I have read his book and I have read his things. So I think you're right. I think he gives some really kind of powerful, here are the 12 steps, here are the rules. And in a life which is full of disaffection and difficulty and suffering, he speaks to that in a major way. Like, I asked some of my students what they thought about him, and I gave them no kind of introduction to it. I sent them the link to the 12, and I spoke largely to some male students, and they said, not into self-help, but they could see the appeal, right? It resonated with them. And I think that's important. I think we should really take that seriously, right? So one of the things that I listened to a lot of Peterson this last week, and I think one thing he does for me is kind of raise some questions about the kind of lack of kind of simple, direct action on the left, like if you want kind of an alternative politics. And so I think what happens, at least in my kind of reading of recent culture, is that things that we associate with the left, like political correctness, kind of cultural appropriation, kind of questions around that, become represented in a very, very kind of silly way, which makes no sense to the majority of us. So when we're talking about kind of Bruno Mars kind of being guilty of a cultural appropriation in his music, you're like, some of us are putting our hands in the air and saying, what has this got to do with suffering and reality? What has this got to do? And it seems like not something that resonates with many people. There was another example I'd written down for a question, so I can maybe just, I'm sorry to take over. But the Princeton University professor very recently cancelled a course he teaches on cultural freedoms and hate speech after his use of a racial slur during a class discussion. He'd been teaching it for 40 years, the same class for 40 years, and for the very first time he had a group of students kind of walk out of his class. And the question for an academic like me is like, what is going on? You know, what has brought us to this situation where that occurs? And is it useful if you are interested in progressive politics? And are there Petersons in the world ready there waiting to kind of take advantage of that, if you want? Maybe not take advantage is not the right word for you, but from my perspective, that's how maybe I might see it. So I think you raised a really good question, right? Direct rules.
I think it's important to say, though, it wasn't, he didn't use it, he mentioned it.
He mentioned he used it, yeah, he talked about it.
Yes, so that's a big difference. I'm a little perplexed about your comment of the lack of academic integrity. Could you explain that a bit?
Well, this debate was focused on Jordan Peterson, and one person has read the book but failed to mention anything other than one rule in his book. The moderator talked about the first chapter, in which I don't agree with your interpretation of that, and then the dissenter for rebutting Jordan Peterson, you said right off that you haven't even read his book. So how can you have an academic discussion about something that you're yourself not familiar with?
So did you feel that I was quite ignorant of Peterson?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Any specifics? Because I've listened very extensively to his talks.
Well, I feel like his message is direct and it's archetypical, which is why it's attractive to masses. And in terms of being a male following or whether or not it's for a specific demographic, there are also many confounding factors that would go into that, such as most YouTube viewers are male, and that was how he became.
Sure.
So I think those are things that should be taken into consideration, that should be discussed in a panel like this.
Well, one can't discuss everything, and of course, if
But what did you discuss?
well, I think we discussed quite a bit. You might have think it was entirely vacuous,
Well,
but
Yeah. We didn't actually discuss anything that he has talked about. We talked about.
Let me just interject here, because we do have to wrap up things, but I so appreciate your comments. Anouar's going to finally come and say a final point, and then we're going to have to wrap it
Your
up.
question actually dovetails with Ali's in the sense that your question dovetails with Ali, Professor Ahmeda's question, in the sense that, I understand the attraction, I understand why people would listen to him and adhere to his principles and his views, because there is a dimension of social life in the United States or North America or in the West even that has led to a sort of spiritual, emotional, whatever crisis. So that's why even if we use the grandiose description of prophet, that's why prophets appear. Prophets in the Middle East, if you go back to history, they come to address a need, a tremendous need for something. Something is missing, some representation is lacking, people do not have someone to speak for them, people feel alienated from something. So Jordan Peterson appears, prophet-like, if you will, Messiah-like, if you will, to speak to you, to speak to others who have been abandoned, because you feel abandoned by the social norms that no longer fulfill you in a way. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm just trying to understand this as a cultural critic. So that's why I would argue, and please disagree with me if you will, that's why you find his views attractive to you.
Well, my understanding of this forum is that we were actually going to be discussing views, in which we didn't talk about any of his things.
If you listen very carefully, he's a very tentative and is a speaker. He speaks. He doesn't fall very strongly on either line, on either side of the argument.
But isn't that the point? Like we were talking earlier today, you guys were talking about how this polarized nature is dangerous. And he is the complete antithesis of polarized nature by kind of saying like, hey, it is fuzzy, it is blurry. So isn't that kind of the point?
So I'm afraid to say we're going to have to cut off the debate because it's kind of running over time, I'm afraid. But we do have a reception. So if you'd like to come and talk to some of the speakers.
Sure.
And I think the president is going to come up and say goodbye. But thank you so much for coming.
So thank you. And you raised some really good points. I think what you heard a lot tonight was academics trying to understand the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson. And there is a lot more to be discussed in terms of the specific content of his claims, right? And the pluses and minuses of that. So what I would invite you to do in that spirit is to consider this the beginning, and these guys will hang out longer. We have some reception, we have refreshments over there. So please hang out and continue the conversation amongst yourselves and with them. I do want to thank both of our panelists, excuse me, and our moderator as well for coming out and doing this. And gentlemen and lady, I have a little gift for you down there. You don't get anything extra in your paycheck, but I do have but I do have a little tchotchke down there for you to share, and I really do appreciate you coming out. And again, I really hope this is the beginning of the conversation. There's a lot more to be discussed, so please hang out and continue the conversation. And if people have other ideas for other topics going forward, do reach out to me. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.